And we now have with us on the line Ellie Belew, who is a novelist and community historian. And Ellie gave me such a wonderful read last night with High Voltage Women Breaking Barriers at Seattle City Light, telling the story of 10 women electrical trade trainees and their fight against the most intense, long-running discrimination at Seattle's public utility. And the book is an absolutely riveting account of what it's like for women and people of color breaking into a segregated workforce. Their strength, their dignity, their growing confidence just radiate through my sheroes. Ellie, thank you for getting up extra early to be with us this morning.
Thank you, Mimi.
Now, let's talk about this gripping story of this multiracial group of women who put their bodies on the line to gain a foothold in the male and largely white electrical trades at Seattle's public-owned utility. And this was in the 1970s. And this was, a kind of affirmative action in the face of really life-threatening sexism and racism. So I don't know if you want to start particularly with the story of maybe Clara Fraser. But yeah, why don't we? Because let's put a personal face on it.
Okay, so Clara Fraser was a longtime activist in the Seattle community who had come up under HUD, taking on and incorporating affirmative action through a number of programs in Seattle. And Seattle, as a city, was under the gun in the early 70s because of its own racism. In particular, sexism was charged later, but they were under federal court mandates to start stepping up affirmative action programs in order to get federal funding for infrastructure. So the City Light, which is a publicly owned utility, hired this activist thinking that she would kind of go in her corner and come up with something fairly innocuous as a program to bring women into the trades, the electrical trade. And anyone who knew Clara Fraser knew she was not going to stay in the corner, and she didn't. So she designed this program facing from ever-mounting opposition. The more she stepped up, the more the administrators of the utility were sorry they had hired her and started to look at ways to fire her. But she did create this program for 10 women to break into the electrical trades at this publicly owned utility.
And how in the process of doing this, really, and then I also want to talk about Heidi Durham, again, to give a sense of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into this. But the coming together, if you will, of feminist issues, of civil rights issues and labor issues, which, Martin Luther King in so many ways describes as really the three faces of evil of capitalism, which is, the unequal distribution of wealth and poverty, which have everything to do with jobs and pay scales, and of course the issue of racism and bias, and he threw in militarism. But all of that really came together in trying to create this program and these really heroic women.
It did indeed, and when this program was initiated, over 300 women, and this is in the early 70s, applied for the opportunity to be in this program. And this is work that involves, it's line workers. These are the people who work with high voltage lines, go up the power poles and deal with whatever is mounted on them, the equipment. And this was the first opening for women to try this program. So 300 women applied, 10 women were chosen, and it was a mixed group in every way. It was mixed racially in terms of there was one Asian woman, 2 black women, 1 Chicana. It was mixed in terms of gender identification, gay and straight. It was mixed in terms of economic class in the sense of all the women were poor at the time, but some had more education and opportunities than others. And then with very little, the program fell apart almost before it started in terms of what it had promised. So these women were put out to begin work before they'd gotten their first paycheck, so they didn't even have money, some of them, to buy the work clothes that were required for the job. So that was the start of it. And the administration, as I said, all white, all male, at the top level, did not see this coming. They had thought they would be able to kind of placate liberal Seattle with the program, not with the actual women. They hadn't really thought what was going to be like when they actually had women on the work site.
Well, to get back to Clara Fraser, right? So here's this woman, and there were groups like Freedom Socialist Party and so on. I mean, this was a real political onslaught that, again, really brought together the issues of discrimination and civil rights and labor rights and so on, and gender, of course. The issue of the things that Fraser, let's go a little deeper into it. She really, from my reading, God, did she face the wrath of management. And I want you to talk a little bit more about how that actually happened. She went on to sue the city for discrimination on the basis of sex and political ideology, which is all part of this extraordinary story and this phenomenal book, High Voltage Women, Breaking Barriers at Seattle City Light.
Yeah, so she actually, and the ETTs, or what they call the trainees, they also brought a claim for sex discrimination, it was called at the time. Now, Clara Fraser, they were after her from the beginning, as I said, as she designed the program, and then as she tried to carry it out. And it was insidious administrative kind of harassment for her, which is why she added the political harassment. She was a known activist, but that didn't stop them from pursuing her. And so they charged her with things she hadn't done in terms of her actual work. They took her off the program as soon as the women came on and were actually in the field. They transferred her off the program so that they had the trainees had no administrative support. And so Clara Fraser, was a member of the Radical Women, and so were three of the women who were chosen to be in the trainees. So they led the political charge on challenging the city and the city-owned utility, both in court and on the work site. And I have to say that the 10 women were not in total solidarity in the sense of they were not all political activists. They were activists in the sense that they wanted the same kind of pay and the same kind of treatment on the work site as the men who had the jobs.
And I want to get into, and again, I'm glad that you mentioned that there were members of Radical Women and the Freedom Socialist Party, because this is the kind of thing that when you talk about being a socialist, or what is a socialist, these kind of programs and these kind of things and living it are what we who consider ourselves to be socialist-oriented, should be advocating. Now, having said that, talk about Heidi Durham, who was another one of the trainees, and the kind of job harassment that she failed, because we really have to understand what these women did. And while some were and others may not have been, quote unquote, self-consciously political, their actions were thoroughly political and bucked a racist, a system of gender bias to really open up opportunities which still have not been, the door has not fully been kicked in yet, and we still need to do the kicking. But talk about Heidi Durham and her role in all of this and what she faced as one of the trainees.
Okay, Heidi Durham was the youngest of the 10 women that came in on this program. She was 21 when she came on. She was committed. She was a member of the Radical Women and the Freedom Socialist Party at that time. She came on ready to work. They all faced quite a bit of discrimination as they were being trained. Heidi continued on and got herself after much legal maneuvering, was finally allowed to move into training as an apprentice for a line worker. This is the pole work and the high voltage. On the job, she was harassed. She was given work reports and evaluations by one job site leader in particular that were untrue and put greater pressure on her. So on a particular day, she was told to climb these poles up and down with the spikes on her feet and keep up with two guys in a bucket truck, which is a lift truck with a bucket. So she was supposed to be running up and down these poles as fast as these two experienced guys in a bucket truck. So she kept up. She was doing it. She went up. She was coming down. One of her hooks, one of the spikes, hit a knot in the wood and did not bite in. The other one was not fully engaged, and she fell some 30 to 40 feet. And broke her back, life-threatening injury. This is at age 22. So she eventually managed to get herself back, but in the interim, in addition to this fall that I think was based on harassment, one of her coworkers, Megan Cornish, was out on a crew. They heard on their truck radio that there was something that had gone on. Someone had been hurt. They went and called in to find out who it was. They found out it was Heidi, and a coworker of Megan's turned to her and said, "Oh, too bad. Your friend fall down and go boom, boom." So Heidi was crippled for life from this injury and never went back to the line worker apprenticeship, but eventually through legal pressure was hired back on City Light and became basically managed power at a desk job.
And, of course, what Heidi also did, not even daunted by this terrifying, life-crippling injury, this socialist woman participated in their local, the IBEW Local 77, and they pushed it forward. And I want you to talk about that too. So it was management, it was male dominance and misogyny, etc., that harassed, but it was also their efforts to educate their unions.
Yeah, and there was a lot of educating to be done. It was IBEW, the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 77, and at the beginning, the union, it was Clara Fraser that managed to set it up where the trainees, the ETTs, from the beginning of the program were their own unit within the local, which was brilliant. But the local didn't really want them for quite a while until the harassment became so obvious. They were given this letter, a loyalty oath letter, while in training, saying, if you don't sign this letter, you're gone. And the letter says, I will either cooperate with whatever the utility comes up with for a program, or I'll quit right now. And finally, the local said, don't sign that letter. Put this qualifier on the bottom and sign over to the side. That was the first time IBEW stepped up. The 77 stepped up. Over time, but when Heidi's injury happened, the first report that went through the union, the accident report, the union signed off on one saying that it was her own fault for not being a good worker, which, so, but by the end, they actually gave these buttons to the women who survived this whole program. The local honored with a plaque and buttons, radical social bitches is what the button said. And men and women in the local proudly wore those buttons and still do.
Really bravo for this story. And I love the way you described yourself. You're a novelist and you're a community historian, because that makes the history a living reality. And having said that, this book it's a story about the past, but it's the present and the future. And how do you view that as well?
I view that, and as you said, the reason I call myself a community historian is because I'm interested in the interaction of people who identify and work together towards something for at least a period of time. I think, as a woman, I am sorry I can not say this is a Cinderella tale and everything turned out fine and the numbers are all different and everybody's happy at Seattle City Light. There's There's new actions being taken about discrimination at City Light to this day, and we're talking almost 50 years later. However, there is a change on the work site, and I think it's interesting within the union community, especially the trades, there is a shift, and I think it has to do with the first women coming in and the first people of color coming in, where for the first time the so-called FBI of the unions, fathers, brothers, and in-laws, has started to recognize that women and people of color, oh, that's like my daughter. Oh, that's like the person my kids know. So, and in actually working with people different than themselves, I think the union movement has begun, the traditional union movement, begun to understand that it is all of us and not just the FBI, the fathers, brothers, and in-laws. So I view that as a major step forward.
Now, this book is an absolute handbook for political savvy organizing. It's an also inspiring testament, really, to the tenacity and bravery and pure grit of the trainees who stood their ground, did their jobs, and made history.